welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Aarons, and today we'll be looking at a subject which I think is crucial to pianists. There are 6 general vectors upon which a composer may vary their choice of complexity when constructing a piece. Harmonic language, rhythm, articulation and dynamics, sound production, musical gesture, and compositional structure are all areas that can be made to be simple or complex, depending upon the composer's wishes. Furthermore, complexity in one area for a composition might mean that another area must be made simpler so that the audience isn't overwhelmed with information. In this episode, I'd like to talk about harmonic complexity and how this can affect other vectors in a composition. For the moment, we'll stay in the realm of the Baroque. Let's start with a piece that has a very simple harmonic language. The number of different chords is rather small, the use of chord extensions like sevenths and ninths is limited, and essentially the piece is built to be centered on the tonic and dominant chords. I'll play it in full, as it is not a well-known piece at all, especially to pianists. The variety in the music, or the interest for the ear, comes from the ornamentation of the chord structure. The chords progress nicely, if not predictably, like this. But when we fill in the gaps with notes that are within the scale, and trills that help to sustain notes or create acoustic tension, then we end up with the finished piece. On the most basic level, I could say that due to the piece having a simple and predictable harmonic structure, it is necessary for the composer to do something complex on another vector in order to make the piece sound interesting. If the harmony is simple, in this case, then Froberger is choosing to make his ornamentation and rhythmic variety complex enough to compensate. He's making one vector simple and one complex. Let's consider another Allemande by a different composer. Handel takes a more individual approach to complexity than Froberger does. The harmony is definitely more complex, the ornamentation a little more risky, and finally, the structural direction is less formal or predictable. But as you will hear, the rhythms and gestures are definitely simpler, and have arguably less variety than in the Froberger. There's less of a stop-and-go approach with the Handel, and more of a flowing river approach. this case, the harmonic complexity level has increased, along with other vectors too. The points of interest for the listener focus on the harmonic language and the structural risks he takes. As an example, Handel uses chains of harmonic progressions to take us from one sector of the piece to another, and in these chains he essentially repeats material, but only in the sequential keys. Bars 4 to 7 include 2 chains. Later on in the piece, these are repeated. What you have is lots of imitation in the melodic material and gesture, and this imitation allows Handel to make his harmonic language a little more complex. From the listener's point of view, if I have heard this gesture before, then the next one is predictable once it starts. And of course the next one. My mind stops listening carefully to the gesture and starts paying attention to the harmony instead. The same thing occurs just after the halfway point, where imitation of one hand to another leads to a beautiful and unusual chord on the downbeat of the next bar. This kind of harmonic complexity happens at a point of the least complexity in other vectors like rhythm or gesture, and in this way, Handel can showcase his harmonic language without distracting the listener with anything else. So far we've seen 2 Allemands, one of them showcasing a simple harmonic language, and another with a more complex harmonic language. To accommodate these choices, the respective composers decided to adjust the complexity levels of other vectors of composition in order to compensate, and in this way maintain a focal point for the listener. Now, let's look at an Allemand by Bach. This has perhaps the most complex harmonic language when compared to the other 2, but at the same time his gestural and rhythmic vectors are very uniform, his compositional structure is strict and rigidly planned, and the focus is solely on the horizontal harmonic development. cadences that end each section, there is nearly a constant stream of 16th notes, which puts the rhythm and gestural line into a state of continuous motion. This forces the rhythm element into the background of our minds, and we start to focus our listening on the harmonic developments that occur. Bach also uses chains of harmonic progressions, built of imitation, though these happen on a more predictable schedule than the ones found in Handel. In addition, these chains are longer. Handel gives us 2 or 3 harmonic progressions in a chain, like this. Whereas Bach gives us 6 to 7, like this. These lengthier chains allow Bach to travel through keys which Handel cannot get to. This results in passages like this one here, which is, in my view, quite extreme. What you're left with is music that is complex enough on the harmonic level that there is little need to create a complex rhythmic or gestural vector. Repeated rhythmic and gestural patterns can suffice, allowing the complex harmonic language to be the focus of the listener. Now, why is this all important? In order to understand what a composer is trying to say through a piece, it is necessary to identify the primary conduit of expression that is being used. If the wrong conduit is identified, then the choices made by the pianist about their sound quality, dynamic, and tempo may be entirely wrong and even contradictory to what the piece is actually trying to communicate. It's like putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable when speaking. The word is still understood, but the transmission of that word is negatively impacted. In the Froberger, for instance, one can take significant liberties with the tempo and timing of events because the piece is not written as a rhythmic continuum like the Bach. It is more single event driven. I can play the chords in the Froberger almost whenever I want, as long as the single events are beautifully played. On the other hand, the emphasis of harmonic change in the Bach is of paramount importance to communicate to the audience, whereas the harmonic changes in the Froberger are, in some ways, entirely forgettable. There's little point making a big performance gesture about the simple chord progressions, like at this point. Whereas in the Bach, the sequence of chords in bars 9 and 10 are almost heartrending, and requires more time or dynamic change, something for the pianist to signal to the audience that this is a devastating part of the piece. Handel seems to fall in between the two extremes. On the one hand, he sets up a rhythm which is rather constant, like the Bach, and yet he still builds in specific moments where time seems to stop for a while so that we can bask in the effect of either ornaments or single harmonies, like in the Froberger. Notice how in bars 4 and 5 he has a rather fast-moving harmonic progression, but then he slows down the progression right after so that we can focus on the rhythm and the gesture instead. priority helps to tell us as pianists when to take time, when to play metronomically, when to emphasize a melody, or when to allow the harmony and accompaniment to take precedence. Consider that in the bars where the harmony changes are few, we may consider moving the piece a little bit forward by playing a little faster, like this. We wouldn't, however, think to play them slower, because the piece might grind to a halt if we did. Nothing is happening. On the other hand, if we have the tight harmonic sequences like we do in bars 27 to 30, we would ruin them completely if we play them faster, or move the tempo somewhat. It's almost beneficial to play them slightly slower, so that the harmonic sequences have time to make their effect. Each pianist approaches these problems differently, and that's why we have so many different interpretations that exist in the recording and performance spectrum. This is not to say that all interpretations are equally effective. Some are definitely more effective than others. But what is most important is that there is a logical foundation upon which these interpretational decisions are grounded upon. But to make those decisions, one has to first recognize the parameters that composers are using for their levels of complexity. I'll talk more about this subject in other episodes, but for now, keep making music and try to observe where a composer is making something complex and where they are keeping things simple. This can help you to determine what you want to emphasize and communicate to the audience. Bye for now.